Hello, everyone. It's Paul J. Leslie on the Expanding Perspectives and Perceptions channel. We are talking to a gentleman that I am been really excited to talk to and enjoying his work for a good while. That's Dr. Kingsley Dennis, who is with us today. He is a sociologist, an author, and a researcher, and he specializes in such diverse topics as systemic thinking, complexity theory, new emerging global technologies, science, spirituality, and consciousness. He's the author of over 20 books on all kinds of different topics that I think will touch on many here. So, Dr. Kingsley Dennis, thanks so much for being with me today.
Well, thank you, Paul. A pleasure to have your invitation.
Well, I want to start today something that you wrote recently that I think is so pertinent to a lot of us who are we're expanding our perceptions, hence the name of the channel. You wrote a little bit about different perspectives that people take in a recent newsletter you sent out. And I wonder if you could just, to start us out with, from your background as a sociologist, as a consciousness researcher, all this, you have a different kind of way to see how people perceive their world, and how sometimes those perceptions, different levels of those perceptions, create certain complex situations that not always the best response to our natural world. Could you just kind of start us out by talking a little bit about from your perspective?
Of course. Well, that essay you mentioned came around quite spontaneously because recently, of course, with so much going on in the world, especially even in the last 2 years, we're receiving so many impacts and stimuli. At the same time, we're trying to communicate with each other, and there's so much information. There can be misinformation. And it occurred to me that I could be standing, or anyone could be standing right next to each other, two people. They could be friends, family, or anyone. No matter how close physically you are, you could be close to them, but then realize you have a different reality perspective. You're not on the same page, as we say. And you could be a completely different kind of not corresponding in your communication. And of course, again, what's been happening in the world now was, there's so much emotional, psychological stimuli that also, people are getting into arguments, and they're trying to get into combative, persuasive encounters where they want people to, agree with their viewpoint. And it occurred to me, well, of course, like anything, there's different degrees of everything, and perspective and perception also. And if we can recognize that people are maybe in a different scale of perception, then maybe we can step back and not get into this conflict. We realize that someone else is in a different place. So for the sake of brevity, I kind of put this as 2D, 3D, and 4D. I don't mean like cosmic dimensions, but just in a kind of, it's a way of putting a scale to something. And the 2D one, I perceive as being, quite flat, or really the dominant consensus reality. And this is another subject that I've written about in the last few years, is how, we are conditioned into certain perspectives and certain narratives. And of course, the reality that we live in, whether it's national or international, there are certain consensus narratives for that scale. So if you're born in a certain country, whether it's the US of A, whether it's England or any other country, we enter certain degrees of conditioning when we're born into that country. We go through education, and then our social institutions, our legal institutions, our peers, our work institutions, they align with a certain narrative which is mainstream, And so what we get from the authoritative news channels, the mainstream media, is generally aligned with an agreed perspective. And generally, there's a polarity in that, whereby it's the us versus them. It's good versus bad. If we do something from our side, it's good. If someone the position does it, then it's not so good. I mean, there's a kind of there can be this polarity in a mainstream narrative. So I said, well, majority of people are in that perspective, and not in a combative way, but that's the way that's the ambience, the environment. And it's difficult to see beyond that because you have to do your personal research. You have to follow intuitions, or you have to allow a certain expansion of your psychological bubble or area of information. And the 3D perspective is one where we feel that we are being, something's not quite right. The information we receive is not what fits with my intuition. I want to look at the bigger picture. And then we see that perhaps the narrative we've been told is not, exactly that truthful, or it may be twisted, or it may be in a certain agenda. And we can see that there are perspectives which go beyond national identities, beyond allegiances, and maybe there are bigger things happening in the world. There's a certain global game going on, or a certain chessboard where, players get moved around. Maybe governments aren't completely in control because maybe there's certain intervention on a global level that have an influence we're not totally aware of. We have the state and we have the deep state. Only in the last few years, people have been talking about the deep state. Before that, it was occult knowledge, not available. So there's that perspective whereby you're stepping, your reality construct has expanded and you're seeing things differently. And then I mentioned the 4D level, which is generally the level that we may associate with wisdom people, sages, seers, that maybe they have a even more expansive perception that goes beyond, transcends our reality construct. It's a transcendental perspective. And maybe they understand that what happens on this planet, the way that humans behave, or way communities or civilizations behave, may be aligned with greater cyclic patterns, cosmic patterns, patterns in the solar system, shifts in consciousness which are collective, not non-local shifts in consciousness, maybe influenced by certain alignments in the heavens, so to speak. And they understand that there's a different timings, different universal orders in operation that influence life on this planet that we're not aware of. So, I mean, in a nutshell, without going into greater detail, that was what I said, Paul, to try just to say that maybe we have to acknowledge that we don't know what we don't know. And people are coming from different positions, and we have to allow for that. Rather than trying to persuade someone or get angry with them, if we can understand they're in a different perspective position, then that puts us, I think, in a better, a more comfortable position, not to, how to converse with people, how to communicate.
Right. I think you mentioned the 3D, because we talk about 2D, 3D, and 4D. 3D, you labeled I thought it was interesting, heretical consciousness. And could you talk just a little bit, you've already explained it, but just a little bit more about what that is kind of the realm of the heretics historically. Could you speak a little more about that?
Sure. I mean, the 2D realm is all about really social management, managing the narrative. And, those who, let's say, the custodians or people involved in managing the narrative, whether it's authority or media, don't like it when people step beyond it, because it's like, to make a crude analogy, you're a farmer and you have a flock of sheep. You don't want one of the sheep to start running off. You want to manage them. It's a crude analogy, but I think you understand that people go off. You can't really predict them. They may upset the apple cart, and they may find out things you don't want them to find out. Mm-hmm. So in history, they were called heretics, and religious heretics are very well known because of the Inquisition. You didn't want a perspective that went against the dominant one. So I called it a heretical consciousness, because now, again, a lot of alternative thinking is immediately labeled like conspirational. Mm-hmm. or the lunatic fringe, Mm-hmm. And of course, there are some conspirational areas. There are something in those areas, but to dismiss it outright without engaging with it, just because you have a label, or you're a conspiracy theorist, you're a lunatic, you're this or you're that, it negates the fact that there are perspectives which are beyond the immediate sphere. And just to finalize there, Paul, we're all familiar with maybe the term paradigm shifts. And with Thomas Kuhn wrote the book about the science of paradigm shift. A paradigm shift occurs when the dominant paradigm begins to have anomalies, things you can't explain. But if there's a few anomalies, they can be absorbed into the main narrative. But when you start getting too many anomalies, the only way you can engage with that is by shifting your understanding and creating new theories and new paradigms. So a heretical consciousness is not necessarily bad. In contrary, I think it's a positive thing in the right way, is that's how you advance. You advance your thinking, you advance your knowledge if you allow to engage with a perspective or heretical consciousness that can bring in new information. So that's why I call it heretical, in a positive way, not in a religious way.
Yeah.
Necessarily.
Although in some ways, granted, hopefully nobody's getting burned at the stake these days, but we can see sometimes people's professional and maybe even personal reputations metaphorically get burned at the stake if they say, hey, I'm just curious, why aren't we talking about this when everyone else is talking about that? It just seems to be real easy, no matter what. If you're in 2D, it's us versus them, either side. But when you take that third 3D, just to say, hey, there's a different paradigm, like you say, that maybe we could explore. Just the very act of saying, hey, this doesn't quite fit. It's real easy for, I don't know whether it's just the existential anxiety of people when things aren't what they felt that they were, and so then they have to jump in and try to subdue the whole Plato's cave allegory is kind of apt with that. What do you feel in your research when people are exposed to different things? I think it is natural that we naturally have that selective perception. So we kick out the outliers, but when there's so much evidence in a viewpoint, why do you think people continue to hold on to that viewpoint, even where it gets to almost, if I dare say, pathological to continue to hold that viewpoint?
Well, true, because my understanding is that people they invest in their beliefs and their viewpoints. And when you invest in it, you have something to lose. So imagine that you've had a belief system, or you've aligned with a certain reality set. Now, if you've lived your life according to that, your life priorities, how you see the world, and therefore you've managed your life according to that perspective or reality set, if you find new information which says, actually, it's not quite like that, maybe you've misaligned your perspective, or maybe you're even quite wrong in some things. It's a hard blow to take if you've lived so much of your life and you've invested your life in that. Something may niggle inside you and think, well, it could be right, but is it worth trying to investigate it? Do I need to go out of my comfort zones? Or you may just say, no, I won't accept that. I've lived by this understanding and it's done me well until now. If you've been cooking the same meal all your life with the same ingredients and you've enjoyed it, why change ingredients? But this is how reality sets get locked in. And going back to systemic theory, systems theory is that certain patterns get locked in. And when they get locked into a set, it's very difficult to move out of that. Many of our systems are locked in. Our energy systems, our mobility systems, they're locked into a certain type of transport. And so you build the infrastructure around it. The mind's the same. When you get a belief system or a reality set, your mind constructs the infrastructure around that to accommodate it. So then you have to change all your internal and your neuronal infrastructure for the new ideas. And for some people, it's very uncomfortable. And not only uncomfortable, it could be seen as an attack against your beliefs, your understanding. And then immediately you go on the defensive. And so reality sets, I think, play a big part in our lives, Paul.
Mhm. Well, as you're saying that, I'm remembering a colleague I had who I won't name, who's a well-known researcher in psychology. In a recent, maybe year or two, edition of a prominent psychological journal came out, and it was this major, major meta-analysis of parapsychology, the field, and
Mhm.
the data was just overwhelming how much significance most of the experiments over time had shown. So by any other measure, in our you're in my field, the statistics of if it shows that significance, we roll with it. Any other field that would at this point been taken as a fact. But it's still all this debate. And my colleague I was mentioning to, I said, "Have you read this?" And his reply, "No, I know it's not. I know it's all
Mhm.
bunk. I've seen that stuff before. It's all bunk. I don't want to." It's like, but this is a major meta-analysis. Nothing I said was going to even make him even just glance at the abstract of the article. And I was like, my God, I'm at Galileo's telescope again. So it's like the rigidity of these views. And so my comment on that comment to you is, uh, when people's lives are at risk, and we don't have that heretical consciousness, it's not good for us, is it?
Not at all, because in fact, without heretical consciousness, society and civilization can stagnate. You need the running water of a stream to keep the stream fresh. Otherwise, and so as I say, the stream is never the same in two places, because it's always flowing. And if it wasn't for this movement in heretical consciousness, revolution in ideas wouldn't occur, whether it's Galileo, Giordano Bruno, who was burnt at the stake. Um, you know, if you don't allow new ideas in, then a society can stagnate. And this has occurred also in the past, where you close your borders, physical and mental, and then of course you're a closed system. And when you're a closed system, then you just become you're the victim of entropic forces. You just wind down, you know. And society and the human being, everything in my understanding, all life is an open system. The ecosystem is open. Humanity is open. The world is a part of the solar system, which is part of a larger galaxy, etc. Everything is intertwined and it corresponds. But if you try to close your borders, take a community. You close your borders, your language doesn't evolve, new ideas don't evolve, your innovations may not evolve. Um, but the example you picked out about parapsychology, um, that's a difficult one, because it's such a sensitive area. Because if you're trying to make someone say, let's change your mind about a soccer team or a football team, there's a kind of wiggle room. You can say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but it's not my favorite team. Okay. But if you're saying, you have invested your life in the material paradigm, let's go to an intangible para metaphysical paradigm. It's like, whoa, that's too big a jump. So revolutions can be incremental jumps, which generally is happening all the time. That's how we move along as a society. Then you get moments of the breakthrough or breakdown, the revolutions, which are the huge leaps, which is, like you say, from material to metaphysical. These jumps come fewer in civilization. But I think we're on the verge of one now, Paul. I think everything we're seeing now about these clashing of thinking patterns and paradigms, we're on the verge of a big jump. But at that moment, things become more sensitive, and people are a lot more, oof, I can't go there, you know.
Yeah, and I think too, you're so spot on in that it's, if it's a big, like say, a lot of investment in, that does become a closed system, mental closed system. And
Mhm.
from my old training in family therapy that saw families as a system, they said you can't change a lot of that. All you can do is perturb the system. So basically, to
Mhm.
give the system a new experience so that it has to reorganize on itself. And what I'm noticing that a lot of people, and I have to say myself too, because I kind of have a tendency to be a little thick-headed sometimes. They have to have an experience of something to really shift that. I mean, for me, a full-on, okay, there is more to a non-local view of mind. I had to have something pretty profound happen to me to go, oh, okay, maybe there's something to this. And so I'm wondering just the experiences that we all seem to have in life, for people who are such a closed system. I'm using this metaphorically in their thinking. It's almost like instead of trying to give new information can't get in, it's almost like we have to give them a new experience, or they have to have that on their own to understand. So for example, if you've never experienced poverty in your life, you have no clue about it, just visiting a town or a village where that exists and seeing it, it's like that changes kind of hopefully the way you see the world. So with that being said, what are your thoughts on people's experiences and altering those perceptions, particularly for these bigger categories like materialism and non-local consciousness?
No, it's a good question, and I think you're right. Is that you can't beat the experiential understanding, because you can show a person how to ride a bicycle, but unless they go on the bike and ride it themselves, they don't have the experience. Or you can say to somebody, explain to me the taste of an apple. Now, everyone knows the taste of an apple. I mean, right now, I've got the taste of the apple in my mouth. I'm sure you have apple. You know it, but try to explain it. Mm-hmm. You can't, unless you have to taste the apple yourself. And that's why there's an old Eastern saying or proverb which says, he who tastes knows. Which means that there's no substitute for experience. Everything else is useful. And like you said about perturbations, I think that's a very useful way of trying to make the paradigm a bit more fluid by sowing the seeds of the perturbations. Mm-hmm. You sow the seeds for the flower to bloom. But for real understanding, you can't be experienced. The case in point of that neurosurgeon, Eben Alexander, mm-hmm. Who was a doctor in material paradigm, and then when he had his near-death experience and his consciousness left the body, he understood it because he had a near-death experience. But it's very difficult for other people to align with that belief because it's that's so outside of my paradigm. But what happens in these, let's say, transitional moments, we can call them kind of revolutionary moments. In the science of complexity, they're called tipping points. And like you're building a sand castle on the beach, and it's going up and up, and the last few grains of sand, you put it on and the whole thing collapses. You get to that point where the fragility is very delicate. And at that point, I think our life experiences are more open to new experiences coming in, because when society is stable, when that sandcastle is on the foundations, nothing much moves it. When you have a stable paradigm, a stable consciousness pattern, it's very difficult to shift out of it. But when you get to the tipping point, the last few grains on the sandcastle, or where society is moving around so much, things I can't believe, there's new theories, there's world events which are rocking my world, then actually your mind is a lot more sensitive. Your experiences are open because you're less locked in. And that's when a person is more able to allow new experiences. And I think, again, we can see that, I think recently and now the world is coming to that kind of stage where it's been stable for a relatively long period of time. But now things are like, we're seeing things that we perhaps thought we wouldn't see in our lifetime. And that's when we are able to maybe align with different perspectives. So we should be careful, but I think we should be aware that maybe we can learn new things.
And the constantly learning new things, I think we have to be open to a consistent revisioning of where we are. because as you said, we can become very, very stagnant. I wanted to ask you personally, how do you stay less stagnant in your research and your work? I mean, it just, when people, and I'm going to put a link into your website, you go and see the books and how many different ways you see things. And I know you're very involved with all different ideas on new technologies that come out and all. How do you keep yourself from being stagnant in how you approach new data, new information?
Well, the first thing I had to do was leave academia.
No comment.
Yeah, and I again, when you're in a circumstance or environment and you realize that you can't go any further, then sometimes you might have to take a jump. So just to make it clear to you and anyone listening that I made a choice to go freelance and leave academia, and then my vistas opened up and I was free to kind of follow different avenues. I don't have any recipe. I just follow nudges, a kind of interior nudge, that something that comes across my radar. I think, there's something there, and then I may leave it aside or make a note of it. If I get, if the nudges come back 2 or 3 times, it's like, whoa, there's something to investigate. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a fixed plan, and sometimes I'm researching for a book, and just as I'm finishing it, something that comes across my radar, and just naturally I go to it, and also I think it's a kind of, for me, it's a kind of a combination of my own studies, or what I would call my life studies, and my personal life. I spent a lot of time in my earlier, let's say, youth, in my 20s and 30s, traveling and living and working in different countries. And then I came across things which could connect with, let's say, theories or understanding. For example, I was living in Turkey and I was learning about different understandings from the Turkish perspective. And at the same time, I came across Fritjof Capra and his book on the web of life. And I thought, this web of life book about the interrelation of living systems, it goes exactly with the kind of folkloric Eastern wisdom tales that I was coming across. So I thought, well, let's look at those together. So I've always had a kind of dual combination. I take scientific data, sociological data, and then I look at it from my personal interests point of view, which is usually based around consciousness and developing our awareness and conscious evolution. And that's why they've kind of combined. And I always see, my perspective is that I find that the tangible material world is constantly in interaction with the intangible world. Our conscious is always intertwined with our unconscious or subconscious. There's a correspondence between realms going on all the time. And I've tried to, I suppose, recognize that and try and bring it into my work. And that naturally just leads me down different avenues. But then again, I've been, let's say, criticized by a science perspective by saying you're too pseudoscience, you're too non-science. And then other people on the consciousness field saying, but you're using too much data. So, you can't please it, but I just go where kind of nudges and coincidences kind of just lead me, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I want to return just for a moment back to what we were talking about earlier about 2D, 3D, and 4D consciousness that you've written about. I remember the mathematician George Spencer Brown said that all reality is an act of creation that you make when you make a distinction between things. So 2D to me is, like you said, it's that this or that, us versus them. to get to that 3D, just it sounds like the simple act of looking at multiple viewpoints with an open mind, taking a third and fourth position to a subject or a topic is a gateway into that. But now when we get to 4D, we're entering into a whole different realm that very few people enter. Do you feel that that is something that most people can go into, or is it just that there's a select few who will naturally move past 3D into 4D perspectives?
Well, yeah, and that's a good question, and I would say that all people have the capacity for this. My feeling is that all people have the innate capacity to evolve or their understanding and to reach, let's say, a metaphysical or transcendent perspective. It's open. That realm is open, but very, very few people want to go there. They don't choose that as a path to go there. They may see it as a closed door. I like to say a closed door is not necessarily a locked door. You have to go there and try the door handle. And and if you are very heavily involved in your life, and my sense is that the 4D perspective is it takes more effort, and you really have to make a conscious choice to want to kind of research it or go there. And maybe you have to step out of, you have to have, let's say Maslow's hierarchy of needs to kind of frame this. I don't want to be too crude, but we have to look after our life situation first. We have to have a comfortable life. We have to feed ourselves. We have to look after our loved ones, and we have the social, cultural needs. And my feeling is that the 4D is something that you research after that, because you have to look after your immediate needs. And so the world is very much geared towards keeping people in the immediate needs. And it's very few of us who say, okay, I'm now going to take part of my life time, my life focus, my life energy to look and go towards this perhaps transcendent point of view. So it's not for everybody, not because it's closed off, but because majority of people are too involved in the normal life experience. And, and to go to the 4D, you really have to, make effort to shift out of a reality construct. Because, reality, we validate our reality constructs all the time. But we have to really, make a concerted effort. So it's not for everybody, but it's open to everybody, I would say.
Yeah, it is hard, I would think, to focus on a 4D or sometimes even a 3D when our culture, our society naturally tells us that all these other things are a priority. Getting the 401k in place and the mortgage and the raising the family, and those are obviously all important. But when so much emphasis of importance is placed on the mundane, then obviously our attention feels pulled away. This is going to sound, this question to you, I hope that the viewers will take it the spirit that's given. Do you think it's a concerted effort by some people to keep us focused on the mundane rather than to move up 3 and certainly into 4D?
I would answer you honestly, yes, I do. And again, we speak about this in a delicate way because we don't want to, kind of put people off, let's say, or get people worried. But the consensus narrative is a part of social management. If you want, because societies, ever since we urbanized ourselves and moved away from the pastoral agricultural stage, we moved into ever denser, complex societies, and you have to manage people. And societies, a certain degree is self-organized, but when you get to a level of complexity, pure self-organization doesn't work. Yeah. It does if you're maybe in a family or a community. So it is managed. a certain part of that management is beneficial. We have to regulate, we have to give social services, we have to give health, we have to regulate that everyone has equitable access for well-being. That's socially managed, and that's a positive side. But then there's a level whereby it goes further, and it says, well, we want to keep, people managing their jobs, maybe keep them, aligned, well, not aligned, maybe trapped inside mortgages or debt systems. And so they don't want to think about a new social system. They don't want to go against the governmental structures. They're too busy just, focused on their everyday life. And okay, we may throw in some entertainment systems for them, make sure they have whopping 52-inch plasma TVs so they can be comfortable at home. I say that jokingly, but it is managed that we have a certain level of well-being, but it's also managed that people don't think too much beyond the structures that are the mainstream structures. And I think that is in place, yes. But it's a normal part of conditioning. We just have to recognize that people are under social, cultural conditioning. That's how you maintain national identities. Mm-hmm. That's how governments could go to war with the people because you believed in your nation identity. So these are operating for centuries, millennia. It's not anything new. It's just a lot more complex and a lot more pervasive now, I would say.
And I'm assuming that you think all the new technology that we have with all the benefits and drawbacks has also helped people maybe become more aware of these control systems?
Mm-hmm. For sure. I mean, we could not be having this conversation, 2 decades ago or before the internet or World Wide Web, because information was limited. And this has always been, civilizational growth has always been aligned with information. And for centuries, for example, when people were not literate, they would receive mostly, the only information they would see would either be from the local priest talking about what's happening in the community, and they would go to church and listen to the Bible being read to them. Because the Bible was in those days in Latin, and only the priest or the priest hierarchy knew Latin. And then when the Gutenberg press came along, they could print these books, and then we had the Protestant Reformation, and the Bible was put into English as well, and not in Latin, and then printed and distributed. People could read the Bible for themselves and began to learn how to read. Take that further, way further now to the internet. At every stage, what you're doing is you're decentralizing information. And when you decentralize it, it allows more people to get direct access to it and then to make up their own mind. So before the internet, there wasn't an alternative media. Everything was the state channels and the state news and, public newspapers, which aligned with the main narrative. And now people can do their own research. They can correlate information and say, look at this against this. They can go international to other countries and see what other countries are saying. For sure, this has expanded people's thinking patterns and consciousness, for sure. And it's, apart from the negative sides of technological control, the beneficial sides have been overwhelmingly important for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Well, and with that new knowledge and new perspectives and just overall understanding, it's almost like there is this natural clash between the way we've always done things, and the way things could be, because there's comfort in the way we've always done things. I mean, do you feel that's the case? Why a lot of people are real hesitant to change up?
Well, yes. I mean, again, we have to try to balance this up and say, just because we can change, is it going to be a beneficial change?
Right.
So, we've done, the comfort zone, the security of always done it this way is beneficial until it's detrimental.
Mhm.
And so the point is when do we realize the systems are becoming detrimental to where we need to go to? Because if you repeat detrimental systems, you start to devolve, you don't progress, or you progress in a way which is not beneficial for the good of humanity. So just as we have information, we have misinformation. Just because information is coming from an alternative source doesn't immediately mean it's right or it's correct. We have misinformation on the alternative side, just as we have it in the mainstream side. So the more information, the more discretion, the more discernment. And I would say to people now that a very important quality now in the world has to be discernment, because there's so many things thrown at you, so many impacts, that when we come to a point of, okay, change is now required, it doesn't mean you have to grab hold of the first thing that's given to you, And I've also compared it to the analogy of a baton relay race. Let's say there's 4 people in a relay race, and the first person is running the first 100 meters, and you've got the baton. But to proceed on the race, you can't keep on running, because if you run the whole race with a baton, you'll be expelled. You have to pass the baton on, but don't pass it on to a competitor. You use discernment to pass it on to your teammate, and they can progress further. And so I think this is important about change: is you pass the baton at the right time, not too soon, not too late. We have to know when it's the right time to leave incumbent systems when they're no longer working. But we have to pass it on to the correct teammate. Know that we're passing it on for betterment, not for something dodgy or may not work in our favor. So there's these questions. It's never black and white. We have to, I think, take into account there's these other degrees, and always degrees of change.
Mm-hmm. And discernment, I think you're very apt at saying that's something that is sorely needed now, because it tied in with critical thinking. It's a form of critical thinking. Placing things in categories, and does this fit the category? Is this even true? And I'm just to focus on that for just a moment. What advice would you have for people who are getting all this information? They found themselves moving into 3D. What's the best advice you can give them on how to be better at discernment?
I would say it's all about having a filtering system. The human tendency is to believe what we kind of instinctively want to believe. And it's quite painful to believe something which we weren't expecting. Mm. And so even if the alternative news comes around saying like this, the mainstream news is wrong, this is right. And you think, that's what I was thinking all along. I knew I was right. It's so easy to pick at that, and you may be right, but don't take it straight away. I would say we need to have a filtering system where we pause and say, I'd like that to be right, but let me look at it from all different sides. Let me see another point of view first. I want to see, like when you're buying a new car, you don't always buy the first one you see. You look at 3 different cars and you want to say, okay, I like that one to begin with, but I won't choose until I've eliminated the others. So I think we have to eliminate others before this is the filtering mechanism, before we actually accept something. It's too, we're too eager to choose the first alternative that comes across our desk. And so I would say, step back, take a pause, take a breath. You've got time. You don't have to choose right away. It's not a $60 million question quiz show where you've got 10 seconds to choose your answer. Take your time, take a breath, look at it from different angles. And if it feels right, if it tastes right, if it smells right, if it looks right, okay, accept it, but do more than one taste test, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has just been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I feel that we could have continued even more and more deeper down the rabbit hole, but I think we probably a good stopping part. Before we go, though, Kingsley, please, will you tell people who are very interested in your work, your books, your lectures, where's the best place to find you, and kind of tell us any upcoming things you may have going on?
Sure, Paul. I mean, I always say, please come, anyone interested, come to visit my website. It's kingsleydennis.com. Again, having that name is quite lucky that there's not many websites, Kingsley Dennis. If you go on there, I have a menu button called Writings, and I have Essays button, and I have 60, 70 essays or more. It's all free for people to look at, download, read. Please do. And have a YouTube channel where I put up some of my videos or readings. I do have soon a new book coming out. If you don't mind, I will say it. It's called Life in the Continuum, where I'm discussing the philosophy of the unified field and commenting on the potential of the unified field for human existence. But otherwise, do your own tasting with me. Read my essays. Do I fit into your understanding, or am I misinformation, or do I say things which you align with? Please make up your own mind. I offer everything in the spirit of sharing and good grace.
Great. Well, I really want to appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule to spend this time with me, and I really got a lot out of it. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Paul, for taking your time out as well. Every conversation is a two-way one. The time's gone so quickly, I'd be happy to come back and speak to you at another time, but thank you.
We'll have to do that. Thanks.